Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Life, Liberty, and My Two Cents. This evening, we are going to take a look at the 1776 report. If you listened to our podcast yesterday, we discussed the 1619 project as well as a little bit about the 1776 report. I intended to post something in the comments on that podcast so that you could check out the report yourself. However, that didn't work out so well. So I've decided I'm going to break up the 1776 report. It is 40-some pages. We're going to break it up over a few podcasts, and I'm going to show you the slides of the pages as well as read and potentially discuss the report. My intention is to present the facts as far as the report is concerned, and I don't want to interrupt those facts with my opinions too much. But we'll go ahead and we will get started on this now. So I'm going to start at the very beginning. You should be seeing these pages as I read them on the screen. They might be a little bit challenging because I'm shrinking it down a little bit, but we'll go from there. So, the introduction. In the course of human events, there have always been those who deny or reject human freedom, but Americans will never falter in defending the fundamental truths of human liberty proclaimed on July 4th, 1776. We must always hold these truths. The declared purpose of the President's Advisory 1776 Commission is to enable a rising generation to understand the history and principles of the founding of the United States in 1776 and to strive to form a more perfect union. This requires a restoration of American education, which can only be grounded on a history of those principles that is accurate, honest, unifying, inspiring, and ennobling. And a rediscovery of our shared identity rooted in our founding principles is the path to renewed American unity and a confident American future. The Commission's first responsibility is to produce a report summarizing the principles of the American founding and how those principles have shaped our country. That can only be done by truthfully recounting the aspirations and actions of the men and women who sought to build America as a shining city on a hill, an exemplary nation, one that protects the safety and promotes the happiness of its people, as an example to be admired and emulated by nations of the world that wish to steer their government toward greater liberty and justice. The record of our founders striving and the nation they built is our shared inheritance and remains a beacon, as Abraham Lincoln said, not for one people or one time, but for all people for all time. Today, however, Americans are deeply divided about the meaning of their country, its history, and how it should be governed. This division is severe enough to call to mind the disagreements between the colonists and King George and those between the Confederate and Union forces in the Civil War. They amount to a dispute over not only the history of our country, but also its present purpose and future direction. The facts of our founding are not partisan, they're a matter of history. Controversies about the meaning of the founding can begin to be resolved by looking at the facts of our nation's founding. Properly understood, these facts address the concerns and aspirations of Americans of all social classes, income levels, races and religions, regions and walks of life. As well as these facts provide necessary and wise cautions against unrealistic hopes and checks against pressing partisan claims or utopian agendas too hard or too far. The principles of the American founding can be learned by studying the abundant documents contained in the record. Read fully and carefully, they show how the American people have ever pursued freedom and justice, which are the political conditions for living well. To learn this history is to become a better person, a better citizen, and a better partner in the American experiment of self-government. Comprising actions by imperfect human beings, the American story has its share of missteps, errors, contradictions, and wrongs. These wrongs have always met resistance from the clear principles of the nation, and therefore our history is far more one of self-sacrifice, courage, and nobility. America's principles are named at the outset to be both universal, applying to everyone, and eternal, existing for all time. The remarkable American story unfolds under and because of these great principles. Of course, neither America nor any other nation has perfectly lived up to the universal truths of equality, liberty, justice, and government by consent. But no nation before America ever dared state those truths as the formal basis for its politics, and none has strived harder or done more to achieve them. Lincoln aptly described the American government's fundamental principle as a standard maximum for free society, which should be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated. But the very attempt to attain them, every attempt to attain them, would, Lincoln continued, constantly spread and deepen the influence of these principles and augment the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. The story of America is the story of this ennobling struggle. The President's Advisory 1776 Commission presents this first report with the intention of cultivating a better education among Americans in the principles and history of our nation, and in the hope that rediscovery of those principles and forms of constitutional government will lead to a more perfect union. 2. The meaning of the Declaration. The United States of America is in most respects a nation like any other. It embraces a people who inhabit a territory governed by laws administered by human beings. Like other countries, our country has borders, resources, industries, cities and towns, farms and factories, homes, schools, and houses of worship. And although a relatively young country, its people have shared a history of common struggle and achievement, from carving communities out of a vast, untamed wilderness to winning independence and forming a new government through wars, industrialization, waves of immigration, technological progress, and political change. In other respects, however, the United States is unusual. It's a republic. That is to say, its government was designed to be directed by the will of the people rather than the wishes of a single individual or a narrow class of elites. Republicanism is an ancient form of government, but one uncommon throughout history, in part because of its fragility, which has tended to make republics short-lived. Contemporary Americans tend to forget how historically rare republicanism has been, in part because of the success of republicanism in our time, which is derived in no small part from the very example and success of America. In two decisive respects, the United States of America is unique. First, it has a definite birthday, July 4th, 1776. Second, it declares from the moment of its founding not merely the principles on which its new government will be based, it asserts those principles to be true and universal, applicable to all men in all times, as Lincoln said. Other nations may have birthdays. For instance, what would eventually evolve into the French Republic was born in 1789 when Parisians stormed a hated prison and launched the downfall of the French monarchy and its aristocratic regime. The People's Republic of China was born in 1949 when Mao Zedong, Chinese Communist Party, defeated the nationalists in the Chinese Civil War. But France and China, as nations, as people and cultures inhabiting specific territories, stretch back centuries and even millennia over the course of many governments. There was no United States of America before July 4th, 1776. There was not yet, formally speaking, an American people. There were instead, living in the 13 British colonies in North America, some 2.5 million subjects of a distant king. Those subjects became a people by declaring themselves such, and then by winning the independence they had asserted as their right. They made that assertion on the basis of principle, not blood or kinship, or what we today might call ethnicity. Yet this fact must be properly understood, as John Jay explained in Federalist 2. Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, and who, by their joint counsels, arms, and efforts, fighting side by side throughout a long and bloody war, have nobly established general liberty and independence. Yet, as Jay and all the founders well knew, the newly formed American people were not quite as homogeneous in ancestry, language, or religion as this statement would seem to assert. They were neither wholly English, nor wholly Protestant, nor wholly Christian. Some other basis would have to be found and asserted to bind the new people together, and to which they would remain attached if they were to remain a people. That basis was the assertion of universal and eternal principles of justice and political legitimacy. But this too must be qualified. Note that Jay lists 6 factors binding the American people together, of which principle is only one. The most important or decisive one, but still only one, and insufficient by itself. The American founders understood that for republicanism to function and endure, a Republican people must share a large measure of commonality in manners, customs, language, and dedication to the common good. All states, all governments make some claim to legitimacy, that is, an argument for why their existence and specific form are justified. Some dismiss all such claims to legitimacy as false, advance to fool the world into believing that their rulers' actions are justified, when in fact those actions only serve the private interests of a few. But no actual government understands itself this way, much less makes such a cynical claim in public. All actual governments rather understand themselves as just and assert a public claim as to why. At the time of the American founding, the most widespread claim was a form of the divine right of kings, that is to say, the assertion that God appoints some men or some families to rule and consigns the rest to be ruled. The American founders rejected that claim. As the 18 charges leveled against King George in the Declaration of Independence make clear, our founders considered the British government of the time to be oppressive and unjust. They had no wish to replace the arbitrary government of one tyrant with that of another. More fundamentally, having cast off their political connection to England, our founders needed to state a new principle of political legitimacy for their new government. As the Declaration of Independence puts it, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind required them to explain themselves and justify their actions. They did not merely wish to assert that they disliked British rule, and so were replacing it with something they liked better. They wished to state a justification for their actions and for the government to which it would give birth, that is both true and moral because it is faithful to the truth about things. Such a justification could only be found in the precepts of nature, specifically human nature, accessible to the human mind but not subject to the human will. Those precepts, whether understood as created by God or simply as eternal, are a given that man did not bring into being and cannot change. Hence, the Declaration speaks of both the laws of nature and of nature's God. It appeals to both reason and revelation as the foundation of the underlying truth of the document's claims and for the legitimacy of this new nation. The core assertion of the Declaration and the basis of the founders' political thought is that all men are created equal. From the principle of equality, the requirement for consent naturally flows. If all men are equal, then none may be right rule another without this consent. The assertion that all men are created equal must also be properly understood. It does not mean that all human beings are equal in wisdom, courage, or any other virtues and talents that God and nature distribute unevenly among the human race. It means rather that human beings are equal in the sense that they are not by nature divided into castes, with normal rulers and ruled. Thomas Jefferson liked to paraphrase the Republican political thinker Algernon Sidney. The mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. Superiority of talent, even a superior ability to rule, is not a divine or natural title or warrant to rule. George Washington Shirley, one of the ablest statesmen who ever lived, never made an outlandish claim, and indeed vehemently rejected such assertions made by others about him. As Abraham Lincoln would later explain, there was no urgent need for the founders to insert into a merely revolutionary document this abstract truth applicable to all men in all times. They could simply have told the British king they were separating and left it at that. But they enlarged the scope of their declaration so that its principles would serve as a rebuke and stumbling block to the very harbingers of reappearing tyranny and oppression. The finality of the truth that all men are created equal was intended to make impossible any return to formal or legal inequality, whether to older forms such as absolute monarchy and hereditary aristocracy, or as to yet unimagined forms we have seen in more recent times. Natural equality requires not only the consent of the governed, but also the recognition of fundamental human rights, including but not limited to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as well as the fundamental duty or obligation of all to respect the rights of others. These rights are found in nature and are not created by man or government. Rather, men create governments to secure natural rights. Indeed, the very purpose of government is to secure these rights, which exist independently of government, whether government recognizes them or not. A bad government may deny or ignore natural rights and even prevent their exercise in the real world, but it can never negate or eliminate them. The principles of the Declaration are universal and eternal, yet they were asserted by a specific people, for a specific purpose, in a specific circumstance. The general principles stated in the document explain and justify the founders' particular actions in breaking off from Great Britain, and also explain the principles upon which they would build their new government. These principles apply to all men, but the founders acted to secure only Americans' rights, not those of all mankind. The world is still and will always be divided into nations, not all of which respect the rights of their people, though they should. We confront, finally, the difficulty that the eternal principles elucidated in the Declaration were stated and became the basis for an actual government. Only a relatively short time ago, yet if these principles are both eternal and accessible to the human mind, why were they not discovered and acted upon long before 1776? In a sense, the precepts of the American founders were known to prior thinkers, but those thinkers stated them in entirely different terms to fit the different political and intellectual circumstances of their times. For instance, ancient philosophers appeared to teach that wisdom is a genuine title to rule and that in a decisive respect all men are not created equal. Yet they also teach that it is all but impossible for any actual living man to attain genuine wisdom, even if wisdom is a legitimate title to rule. If perfect wisdom is unattainable by any living man, then no man is by right the ruler of any other except by their consent. More fundamentally, by the time of the American founding, political life in the West had undergone two monumentous changes. The first was the sundering of civil from religious law with the advent and widespread adoption of Christianity. The second momentous change was the emergence of multiple denominations within Christianity that undid Christian unity and in turn greatly undermined political unity. Religious differences became sources of political conflict and war. As discussed further in Appendix 2, it was in response to these fundamentally new circumstances that the American founders developed the principle of religious liberty. While the founders' principles are both true and eternal, they cannot be understood without also understanding that they were formulated by practical men to solve real-world problems. For the founders' solution to these problems, we must turn to the Constitution. So Section 3, a Constitution of Principles. It is one thing to discern and assert the true principles of political legitimacy and justice. It is quite another to establish those principles among an actual people and an actual government here on earth. As Winston Churchill put it in a not dissimilar context, even the best of men struggling in the most just of causes cannot guarantee victory, they can only deserve it. The founders of the United States perhaps miraculously achieved what they set out to achieve. They defeated the world's strongest military and financial power and won their independence. They then faced the task of forming a country that would honor and implement the principles upon which they had declared their independence. The bedrock upon which the American political system is built is the rule of law. The vast difference between tyranny and the rule of law is a central theme of political thinkers back to classical antiquity. The idea that the law is superior to rulers is the cornerstone of English constitutional thought as it developed over the centuries. The concept was transferred to the American colonies and can be seen expressed throughout colonial pamphlets and political writings. As Thomas Paine reflected in Common Sense, for as in absolute governments the king is law, so in free countries that law ought to be king, and there ought to be no other. But lest any ill use should afterwards arise, let the crown at the conclusion of the ceremony be demolished and scattered among the people whose right it is. To assure such a government, Americans demanded a written legal document that would create both a structure and a process for securing their rights and liberties and spell out the divisions and limits of the powers of government. That legal document must be above ordinary legislation and day-to-day politics. That is what the founders meant by Constitution, and why our Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Their first attempt at a form of government, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, was adopted in the midst of the Revolutionary War and not ratified until 1781. During that time, American statesmen and citizens alike concluded that the Articles were too weak to fulfill a government's core functions. This consensus produced the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which met in Philadelphia that summer to write the document which we have today. It is a testament to those framers' wisdom and skill that the Constitution they produced remains the longest continually operating written Constitution in all of human history. The meaning and purpose of the Constitution of 1787, however, cannot be understood without recourse to the principles of the Declaration of Independence, human equality, the requirement for government by consent, and the securing of national rights, which the Constitution is intended to embody, protect, and nurture. Lincoln famously described the principles of the Declaration, borrowing from Proverbs 25:11, as an apple of gold, and the Constitution as a frame of silver, meant to adorn and preserve the apple. The latter was made for the former, not the reverse. The form of new government that the Constitution delineates is informed in part by the charges the Declaration levels at the British Crown. For instance, the colonists charged the British king with failing to provide or even interfering with representative government. Hence, the Constitution provides for a representative legislature. It also charges the king with concentrating executive, legislative, and judicial power into the same hands, which James Madison pronounced the very definition of tyranny. Instead, the founders organized their new government into three co-equal branches, checking and balancing the power of each against the others to reduce the risk of abuse of power. The intent of the framers of the Constitution was to construct a government that would be sufficiently strong to perform those essential tasks that only a government can perform, such as establishing justice, ensuring domestic tranquility, providing for the common defense, and promoting the general welfare, the main tasks named in the document's preamble, but not so strong as to jeopardize the people's liberties. In other words, the new government needed to be strong enough to have the power to secure rights without having so much power as to enable or encourage it to infringe rights. More specifically, the framers intended the new Constitution to keep the 13 states united, to prevent the breakup of the Union into two or more smaller countries, while maintaining sufficient latitude and liberty for the individual states. The advantages of union are detailed in the first 14 papers of the Federalist, a series of essays written to urge the Constitution's adoption, and boiled down to preventing and deterring foreign adventurism in North America, avoiding conflicts between threats, achieving economies of scale, and best utilizing the diverse resources of the continent. While the Constitution is fundamentally a compact among the American people, its first 7 words are "We the people of the United States." It was ratified by special conventions in the states. The people of the states admired and cherished their state governments, all of which had adopted republican constitutions before a federal constitution was completed. Hence, the framers of the new national government had to respect the states' prior existence and jealous guarding of their own prerogatives. They also believed that the role of the federal government should be limited to performing those tasks that only a national government can do, such as providing for the nation's security or regulating commerce between the states, and that most tasks were properly the responsibility of the states. And they believed that strong states as competing power centers would act as counterweights against a potentially overweening central government, in the same way that separation of powers checks and balances the branches of the federal government. For the founders, the principle that just government requires the consent of the governed in turn requires republicanism, because the chief way that the consent is granted to a government on an ongoing basis is through the people's participation in the political process. This is the reason the Constitution guarantees to every state in this union a republican form of government. Under the United States Constitution, the people are sovereign, but the people do not directly exercise their sovereignty, for instance, by voting directly in popular assemblies. Rather, they do so indirectly through representative institutions. This is, on the most basic level, a practical requirement in a republic with a large population and extent of territory, but it is also intended to be a remedy to defects common to all republics up to that time. The framers of the Constitution faced a twofold challenge. They had to assure those alarmed by the historical record that the new government was not too Republican in simply copying the old failed forms, while also reassuring those concerned about overweening centralized power that the government of the new Constitution was Republican enough to secure equal natural rights and prevent the reemergence of tyranny. The main causes of prior Republican failures were class conflict and tyranny of the majority. In the simplest terms, the largest single faction in any republic would tend to band together and unwisely wield their numerical strength against unpopular minorities, leading to conflict and eventual collapse. The founders' primary remedy was union itself. Against the old idea that republics had to be small, the founders countered that the very smallness of prior republics all but guaranteed their failure. In small republics, the majority can more easily organize itself into a dominant faction. In large republics, interests become too numerous for any single faction to dominate. The inherent or potential partisan unwisdom of a dominant faction also would be tempered by representative government. Rather than the people acting as a body, the people would instead select office holders to represent them. This would refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens, whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. Federalist 10. And the separation of powers would work in concert with the principle of representation by incentivizing individual office holders to identify their personal interests with the powers and prerogatives of their offices, and thus keep them alert to the danger of encroachments from other branches and offices. The founders asserted that these innovations and others combined to create a republicanism that was at once old as well as new, true to the eternal principles and timeless ends of good government, but awake to and corrective of the deficiencies and prior examples of popular rule. One important feature of our written Constitution is the careful way that it limits the powers of each branch of government, that is, states what those branches may do, and by implication what they may not do. This is the real meaning of limited government. Not that the government's size or funding level remains small, but the government's powers and activities must remain limited to certain carefully defined areas and responsibilities as guarded by bicameralism, federalism, and the separation of powers. The Constitution was intended to endure, but because the founders well knew that no document written by human beings could ever be perfect or anticipate every future contingency, they provided for a process to amend the document, but only by popular decision-making and not by ordinary legislation or judicial decree. The first 10 amendments, which would come to be known as the Bill of Rights, were included at the demand of those especially concerned about vesting the federal government with too much power and who wanted an enumeration of specific rights that the new government lawfully could not transgress. But all agreed that substantive rights are not granted by government, and any just government exists only to secure those rights. And they specifically noted in the Ninth Amendment that the Bill of Rights was a selective and not an exclusive list. That is, the mere fact that a right is not mentioned in the Bill of Rights is neither proof nor evidence that it does not exist. It is important to note the founders' understanding of three of these rights that are decisive for Republican government and the success of the founders' project. Our first freedom, religious liberty, is foremost a moral requirement of the natural freedom of human mind. As discussed in Appendix 2, it is also the indispensable solution to the political religious problem that emerged in the modern world. Faith is both a matter of private conscience and public import, which is why the founders encouraged religious free exercise, but barred the government from establishing any one national religion. The point is not merely to protect the state from religion, but also to protect religion from the state, so that religious institutions would flourish and pursue their divine mission among men. Like religious liberty, freedom of speech and of the press is required by the freedom of the human mind. More plainly, it is a requirement for any government in which the people choose the direction of government policy. To choose requires public deliberation and debate. A people that cannot publicly express its opinions, exchanges ideas, or openly argue about the course of its government is not free. Finally, the right to keep and bear arms is required by the fundamental natural right to life. No man may justly be denied the means of his own defense. The political significance of this right is hardly less important. An armed people is a people capable of defending their liberty no less than their lives, and is the last desperate check against the worst tyranny. So that's all that we're going to cover in this podcast of the 1776 report. We will pick up several more pages on a next podcast. I'm going to assume this is going to probably be 3 or 4 different podcasts, but just check back, click the little bell, and you'll get notified whenever we post a video. But we definitely will come back and finish this. I hope that in the reading that you were able to learn some things. It definitely is a more positive light on the founding of the United States. Definitely compared to the 1619 project, but like I said, I want to keep this part to fact and try and limit my opinions, until maybe the end. I'll throw a little bit of opinion out there, but please go ahead and like the video, share, subscribe to our page, and I will see you all later.